The late autumn wind swept through the valley with a sound that felt almost human, a low and restless cry that made the pines lean toward each other, as if sharing secrets. Elizabeth Harper pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and pressed forward on the narrow trail, her boots crunching against the frost-hardened ground. The air smelled of wood smoke drifting faintly from some far-off cabin, and that scent alone gave her enough courage to keep moving. She had been walking since dawn, leaving behind the small town of Stony Creek with nothing more than a bundle of food, a single change of clothes, and the last of her determination. Behind her lay debt's whispers and the hollow silence of a home that was no longer hers. In front of her, she dared not name it too clearly, was only a possibility fragile as the thin ice forming along the creek beds. Elizabeth had once believed her life was safely mapped. At 29, she had been a wife, a partner in her husband's modest carpentry business, and though their life was far from wealthy, it had been steady. Then came the accident, in spring, a fall from scaffolding that ended his life in an instant. Grief struck hard, but what followed proved even crueler. The debts he had kept from her, the creditors who arrived like scavengers, the pitying glances from neighbors that soon turned to avoidance. The town had made its judgment quickly. A widow with no children, no family, and no resources was an inconvenience. The offers of help she received were thinly veiled bargains, men who spoke of providing for her if she agreed to be a quiet companion in their homes. She had rejected them all her pride, a fragile shield against humiliation. But as weeks turned into months, that shield grew heavier than she could bear. It was Clara Green, the boarding house keeper, who first mentioned the man in the mountains. Thomas Rourke, she called him, a giant living alone in a log cabin far above the timberline, rumored to be half savage, half hermit, and wholly unsuited for proper company. He's looking for someone, Clara had said one evening, as the two of them shared tea in the dim parlor. They say he wants a wife, though heaven knows no one down here would consider him. The suggestion had stunned Elizabeth at first. Thomas Rourke was the subject of countless tales whispered among the town's women. Too rough, too silent, too wild. He came down rarely for supplies, towering above others in his worn coat. His dark hair tangled, his beard untamed. Children pointed and stared, then hid behind their mother's skirts. The men gave curt nods, more out of caution than courtesy. And yet no one could recall him ever causing trouble. Elizabeth herself had glimpsed him only once at the blacksmith's, where he stood patiently as his horse was shod, and once at the general store, where he bought flour and lamp oil with quiet efficiency. What struck her most was not his size, though he was broad enough to fill a doorway, but the gentleness with which he had stroked his horse's neck, murmuring something low and soothing, while the animal shifted nervously. It was a small detail, but it lingered in her mind. Desperation, however, has a way of reshaping what seems impossible. By early November, Elizabeth found herself with no money, no shelter beyond the kindness of Clara's boarding house, and creditors who began to knock on the door, with voices less polite than before. One evening, after a particularly harsh visit, she stared into the cracked mirror above her wash basin and whispered aloud, "I cannot go on like this." The decision to seek Thomas Rourke came less from bravery than from exhaustion. She sold her last pair of silver earrings, a wedding gift from her mother, and used the money to buy winter boots and a small parcel of food. Clara asked no questions when Elizabeth announced she would be leaving, though the older woman's eyes carried both worry and sympathy. Now as she trudged higher into the mountains, Elizabeth felt the weight of her choice pressing against her ribs. What if the rumors were true that Rourke was dangerous or mad, or worse? What if he turned her away into the snow with nothing but a laugh? Yet what else remained for her? The world below had already rejected her. At least up here she might discover a new truth about the man hidden in the pines. The trail steepened, winding through rocks slick with frost. Her borrowed horse snorted clouds of steam hooves, striking sparks against stone. Shadows lengthened as the sun dropped toward the western ridges, painting the sky in streaks of copper and violet. She told herself she would turn back if she saw no sign of smoke by dusk. And then she saw it, a thin gray column rising between the trees ahead. Her heart lurched. The cabin appeared moments later, solid and square, built of thick logs with a stone chimney. Smoke curled from the top, and a yellow light glowed faintly in the windows. The place looked less like the lair of a savage than the home of someone determined to endure. Elizabeth dismounted slowly, her legs trembling from cold and nerves alike. She stood for a long moment at the edge of the clearing, clutching her bundle before she forced herself to walk forward. The knock she gave was so soft she feared it would not be heard. But the door opened almost at once. He filled the frame, Thomas Rourke himself, broader and taller than memory, his dark eyes sharp yet startled. The firelight behind him threw his silhouette into bold relief. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then his voice came deeper than she expected, but steady. "Ma'am," he said, as though uncertain if she were real. Elizabeth's carefully rehearsed words deserted her. Instead, what spilled out was unvarnished truth, the kind that carried both shame and courage. "My name is Elizabeth Harper. I am a widow with nowhere else to go. I have heard you seek a wife, and I have come to ask if you would consider me." The silence that followed seemed as vast as the mountains themselves. Thomas did not answer at once. His gaze shifted from Elizabeth's face to the bundle in her hands, then to the horse waiting at the edge of the clearing. Ears pricked and breath steaming, he stepped back from the doorway and lifted one hand, a gesture as careful as laying down a rifle. "Come in," he said softly. "The night will turn mean soon." The room smelled of pine pitch and coffee. A fire glowed inside a wide stone hearth, and a kettle muttered on a black iron hook. The cabin had been built for weather and time: thick log walls, braided rugs, shelves holding tins of flour and beans, a row of well-worn books with their spines knocked pale by use. A fiddle hung beside the hearth, its varnish crazed like ice on a winter puddle. There was no hint of the savagery the town had painted around this place, only purpose, endurance, and a rough kind of order. Elizabeth stood unsure of what to do with her hands. The heat from the fire stung her cheeks after the cold, and her eyes watered without permission. Thomas crossed to a peg and lifted a wool blanket, then thought better of it and draped it over the nearest chair where it could warm before touching her shoulders. "Sit," he said. "Boots off if your toes have gone numb. I'll stir the coals, get the room kinder." She managed to thank you and obeyed. When she bent to unlace her boots, her fingers fumbled clumsily. He crouched beside her without a word and worked the knots loose with big deft hands. The gesture was practical, almost clinical, yet it carried a tenderness that made her throat tighten. He set the boots near the hearth, fetched a flat stone from the edge of the fire, and propped them to dry. "If there's pain when feeling comes back," he said, "we'll wrap your feet and rub them out." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of small sounds: the ticking of sap in the logs, the dull thrum of wind against the shutters, the kettle's whistle rising and falling like a breath. Thomas poured 2 tin cups of coffee and added a trickle of thick cream from a crock. He handed one to her, and when her hands trembled, he steadied the cup with his palm beneath hers until she found the balance. She drank. The heat bit her tongue, then spread like courage down her throat. "I will be plain," she said, staring into the dark pool in her cup. "I have nothing to offer but honesty and hard work. I came because I heard you might take a wife. I do not ask for pity. I ask to be useful and to be treated with dignity." He settled onto a low stool opposite her, elbows on his knees, hands folded as if he were listening to a lesson. His eyes were steady, not probing. "You were clear at the door," he said, "but I'd rather know the ground we're standing on." A pause. "Tell me what chased you up here." She did, because there was no sense pretending. She told him of the accident that had taken her husband, the debts she had learned about only after the grave had closed, the knocks on the door that came earlier each week and left later each visit. She told him about the owner of the general store who had suggested solutions that were not employment, and about the last man who came with 2 companions, and the kind of smiles men wear when the law is too far to reach before dark. "I do not wish to be owned," she said at last. "Not by a debt, not by a man's temper, but I will share a life if it is built fair." He did not flinch at the uglier parts. When she finished, he rose and added a piece of pine to the fire, the flames leaping to lick at its pitch. "You did right to leave," he said. "Down there, some men work out hunger on the nearest weak thing. I know the kind." He turned, leaning one shoulder against the stone. "I will be plain with you too. I have asked twice in years past if 2 different women would join me. They did not laugh, which would have been kinder. They said no, like the word itself had splinters. I decided I would not ask again." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "But if a person knocks and lays their truth on my floor, I will not pretend I am not lonely." The kettle hissed insistently. He lifted it off the hook and set it aside, then crossed to a shelf where a neat stack of folded cloths sat. He chose one and carried it to the table, laid it out like a contract. "This is what I can offer," he said, voice even. "Shelter, food, half of what this place gives me, and a say equal to mine in decisions that matter. I will not raise my hand to you. I will not shame you. I will not expect warmth before trust." He met her gaze and held it. "And I ask three things in return." She felt the air sharpen as if the mountain itself leaned closer. "Name them." First he said truth, even when it stings. "If you want to leave, say so. If I have wronged you, say so." No letting rot set in under silence. Second work, not as a test, but as a way to live without softening into uselessness. "This land asks for hands. My hand's yours if you choose." Third, and here, he hesitated just for a breath. "We go slow. We build something we can stand on. When you are ready to call it marriage in all its pieces, it will be because you choose it, not because the cold forced a bargain." She had not realized she was gripping the edge of the chair until her fingers ached. She loosened them and exhaled carefully, as if the room might break if she breathed too hard. These terms were not the trap she had feared. They were instead a frame. Strong, simple, promised. "I can accept that," she said. "I can give the same." "Good," he said, and the word was a soft thud in the warm air. He showed her the cabin without ceremony. A small sleeping room off the main space held a narrow bed and a chest. "You can take this one," he said. "I use the loft." There was a washstand with a basin and a bar of soap worn thin at the edges. The window looked toward a line of firs black against the last bruised light in the sky. Back by the fire, he set a pan on the trivet and fried slices of salt pork with onions until the cabin filled with clean, simple hunger. He stirred in beans from a crock and a handful of chopped cabbage. When he set the plates on the table, he paused, then slid his own portion to the side and looked at her hands. "You cook?" he asked. "I can," she said, though not fancy. "Fancy keeps no one through a storm. Tomorrow we'll sort what each of us does best." They ate without talking much, but the quiet was not the hollow kind. Once when a gust banged the shutter and snow hissed briefly against the clapboards, their eyes met and held a moment longer than necessary, and whatever passed between them was not yet love, but it was a seed pressed into good soil. After the plates were washed and set to dry, Thomas lifted the fiddle from its peg. "I am poor company," he said, almost apologetic, "but I can offer a tune." He tightened one peg, tuned the strings with his ear, and drew the bow across the instrument. The sound was plain and unschooled, a winter hymn without words. It filled the cabin and reached into corners the fire could not touch. When he was done, he put the fiddle away and reached for a small ledger from the shelf. He set it on the table between them and opened to a blank page. The ink bottle clinked faintly as he unstoppered it. "We will write it down," he said. "Not because I don't trust words spoken, but because paper can be read when tempers rise and memory grows crooked. What we agreed tonight: truth, work, and time." She smiled, then startled by the shape of it on her own face. "Very well," she said. "Put my name to it." He dipped the pen, wrote carefully, then offered it to her. Elizabeth Harper signed with a hand steadier than it had been all day. The wind rose again, prowling along the eaves. Thomas added a log and banked the fire so it would last the night. "Rest," he said. "We will go down to the spring in the morning and fetch water. I will show you the traps and the line I've strung along the creek for deadfall, and we will talk about the men who might come to this door." Her head lifted. "You think they will?" "Men who lean on fear often follow it uphill," he said. "But you are not alone here, and I am not made of smoke. If they come, they will find something solid." She stood, gathered the warmed blanket, and paused at the door of the small room. The cabin's warmth pressed at her back. The ledger lay on the table, the ink drying like a promise. She looked over her shoulder at Thomas Rourke, the mountain man no one wanted, who had set terms that felt like dignity. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he answered, and the word landed like a beam placed true across two waiting posts. In the dark under a roof that did not leak, Elizabeth listened to the wind comb the firs, and to the slow living breath of a place that had decided to include her. Somewhere between those sounds, fear loosened its grip, and a small space opened where something steadier could take root. Morning would bring work and perhaps trouble, but it would also bring the chance to keep building what they had put into words: truth, work, and time. The morning came clear and sharp, the sky washed pale blue by the cold. When Elizabeth stepped out of the small room, she found Thomas already awake, crouched near the hearth as he coaxed the fire into a steady blaze. The smell of boiling oats filled the cabin, mingling with the faint tang of smoke that clung to every timber. "Sleep all right?" he asked without looking up. "Better than I have in months," she admitted. It was true. Though her dreams had been restless, the simple safety of a roof and a locked door had carried her through the night. He ladled oats into 2 bowls, added a drizzle of honey from a stone jar, and set one before her. "Eat plenty. The mountain will ask for strength." After breakfast, he showed her the routines of the place. They carried buckets to the spring, its water so cold it stung her hands. They checked the traps along the creek, finding 2 rabbits caught clean. Thomas showed her how to set them again, how to skin the catch swiftly so the meat would not sour. Elizabeth watched closely, determined to learn. When the chores were done, they returned to the cabin with the rabbits, and Thomas built a small frame outside to smoke the meat. "Nothing goes to waste," he said, hanging the hides on a line. "A mountain winter strips away the careless." It struck her how deliberate everything he did was, no wasted motion, no vanity. Yet there was a gentleness beneath his size and strength. He placed the rabbits into the smoke with the same care he might have used to shelve a book. Inside, he fetched the ledger from the table. "You said you'd keep to honesty," he reminded her. "There's something you should see." He opened the book to another page, one filled with neat figures. "These are my claims. An uncle left them to me. They pay enough to keep this roof over my head, enough for supplies, but no more. If you came here hoping for riches, you will not find them." She shook her head. "I did not come for gold." "Good." He closed the ledger and set it aside. "Then we are clear." Throughout the day, he showed her more of the cabin. The loft where he slept, the small garden plot behind the trees, already rimed with frost, and the woodpile stacked higher than she was tall. "Winter is long," he said. "You cannot fight it, only prepare." She tried to match his pace, though her arms tired quickly when he handed her a smaller axe to split kindling. He noticed but did not mock, simply nodded once and said, "You'll grow into it." When dusk fell, they sat by the fire again. She mended a tear in her shawl while he whittled at a length of wood, shaping it slowly into the form of a spoon. Silence stretched between them, but it was a silence she could live with, not the kind that stifled. After a while, she asked the question that had been pressing since last night. "Why do they speak of you the way they do down in town, savage? Dangerous, untouchable." His knife stilled. He set the wood aside and leaned back. "Because I am large, because I keep to myself, because I do not laugh at their jokes or play their games. When a man does not bend, they say he is broken. It is easier than admitting he simply stands straight." She let that settle, then asked, "And are you lonely?" His eyes met hers, dark and steady. "Yes, but I would rather be lonely than false." She looked down at her shawl, at the neat line of stitches. "Perhaps now you do not have to be either." A quiet fell, warmer this time. But the peace did not last. The next day, as they were carrying wood to the stack, Thomas froze, his head turning toward the trail below. Elizabeth followed his gaze and saw faint movement through the trees. 3 riders climbing slowly their horses, leaving dark tracks on the frosted ground. Her stomach dropped. She recognized the shape of the man in front, Edward Miller, her husband's creditor, the one whose threats had driven her to leave town. "They've come," she whispered. Thomas set down the wood and straightened to his full height, his shoulders broad as the doorframe. "Go inside," he said. "Bolt the door." "What will you do?" His voice was calm, though his jaw tightened. "Stand between you and them, same as I would against a storm." She obeyed, retreating into the cabin, but she pressed her face to the small window slit and watched as the riders approached. Miller called out, his voice carrying sharp and ugly through the crisp air. "Mrs. Harper, we know you're here. Debts don't vanish in the mountains. Best come down before we take what's owed." Thomas stepped forward, planting his boots firmly in the clearing. He carried no rifle, only the weight of his size and his steady voice. "You'll turn back," he said. "She owes you nothing that justifies this ride. Not here. Not today." Miller laughed. "And who are you to tell me what's mine?" Thomas did not move. "The man who will stop you." The wind hushed as if the mountain itself held its breath. Elizabeth's fingers dug into the window frame as she watched the men shift uneasily in their saddles. Thomas stood like a wall of stone, unmoving, unshaken. For the first time since her husband's death, Elizabeth felt something fierce bloom inside her. Not fear, not despair, but the fragile beginnings of hope that maybe she had found the one place in the world where she could stand without crumbling. The standoff had only begun, but she knew whatever happened next would decide more than her future. It would decide if the life she had gambled for could truly hold. Miller dismounted first, swinging down from his saddle with the arrogance of a man who believed the law rode behind him. His boots crunched on the frosted ground as he strode closer, the two other men flanking him like wolves circling their alpha. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Miller said, his gloved hand resting lazily on the butt of his pistol. "She owes and debt demands payment. I'll not ask twice." Thomas did not shift an inch. His breath steamed in the cold, but his voice came out steady low, carrying farther than a shout could have. "You've already asked once down in town. The answer hasn't changed. She's not yours to claim. Not here. Not ever." Miller sneered. "You think hiding her up here makes her clean? Her husband borrowed my money? He died before paying. That leaves her, and if she can't pay with coin, then she can pay with service." The town would agree. Inside the cabin, Elizabeth pressed her back against the wall, her heart hammering. The words stung, but she clenched her fists and refused to let shame seep in. Thomas's voice rolled through the door, a shield between her and the venom outside. "What the town agrees or whispers has no weight on this mountain," Thomas said. "You'll take your horses and you'll ride back." "I won't say it again." The second man spat in the snow. "You talk big for a hermit with no allies. 3 of us against 1 of you. We'll drag her out and you can watch." For a moment the air snapped tight, ready to break. Then Thomas moved. Not fast, but with a certainty that made the 3 men stumble back a step before they even realized it. He reached the woodpile, lifted the splitting axe with one hand, and carried it as if it weighed nothing. He planted the haft into the frozen ground, the blade gleaming in the weak sunlight. "You'll not cross this line," he said, his voice quiet, almost gentle. "Try and I'll put you down like a rabid dog. No shame in a man dying who came with ill intent. Shame is already yours for riding up here with it." The words hung in the air like the toll of a church bell. Miller's mouth twisted. Bravado warred with unease in his eyes. He looked to his companions, but neither met his gaze. They shifted in their saddles uneasy. The mountain was silent, watching, and Thomas stood like he belonged to it, immovable immensity in human shape. "This isn't over," Miller spat at last. "You can't keep her hidden forever. Debts follow." Thomas leaned on the axe haft, utterly calm. "Let them follow the wind then, because you won't be coming back." Miller swung up into his saddle with a curse, jerking the reins so hard his horse snorted and reared. The 3 men turned their mounts and rode down the trail, the sound of hooves fading into the timberline, until the clearing was quiet once more. Elizabeth sagged against the doorframe, her knees weak. When Thomas stepped inside, his expression was as steady as it had been outside, though his eyes softened when they found hers. "They'll be back," she whispered. "Perhaps," he said, setting the axe aside and closing the door firmly. "But when they come, we'll be ready. A wolf pack tests a fence once, twice, then gives up if it holds. We'll make this place a fence too strong to test." She swallowed hard. "I thought you might kill him. Only if I had to." He poured water into a basin and washed his hands slowly, the motions deliberate. "Violence leaves stains that don't wash clean. I use it only when I must." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "But I will use it if it means keeping you safe." The words struck her deeper than she expected. Not the promise of protection, but the restraint behind it. He was not a brute looking for a fight. He was a man carrying strength like a tool, not a weapon. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Elizabeth found her hands trembling as she stitched a tear in one of Thomas's shirts. Not from fear, but from the storm of feelings that had risen in her chest. Gratitude, relief, and something warmer. Something she dared not name yet. "You stood for me today," she said at last. He was carving again, shaping the wood into the curve of a bowl. He did not look up. "I stood for what was right, but it was me they wanted." His knife paused, then resumed, then all the more reason to stand. The silence that followed was filled not with distance, but with understanding. Outside, the wind roamed the ridges. Inside, the fire crackled, and for the first time in many months, Elizabeth felt as if she had a place where her presence was not a burden, but a fact as undeniable as the walls around her. Before retiring, Thomas set the ledger on the table again. "Truth," he reminded her. "We'll write down what happened today so we don't let fear twist it in memory, and so we remember what we stand for." Together they wrote. Miller came. He was turned away. This home stands against such men. Elizabeth signed her name beneath it, her handwriting steadier than it had been 2 nights ago. When she lay in her bed that night, the mountain air cold against the shutters, she did not fear sleep. Instead, she whispered to the dark, "I am not alone." And for once, the words felt true. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm rough but steady. Mornings began with the breath of frost clouding the windows and the sound of Thomas stirring the fire. Together, they hauled water from the spring split wood and tended to the snares. Elizabeth's hands blistered, then toughened. Her back ached from chopping kindling, but she refused to complain. Each task felt like a piece of armor, forged against despair. Thomas watched without interfering, unless she asked for help. When her axe swings glanced and the wood toppled instead of splitting, he simply showed her once more his massive hands guiding hers, the motion precise and efficient. "Let the weight of the tool do the work," he said. "Don't fight it." She found herself remembering those words even in quiet moments. Don't fight it, let the weight carry. Inside the cabin, she began to carve out her share. She scrubbed the floorboards until they shone with a pale, luster-mended blankets worn thin at the edges, and cooked meals with what they had smoked rabbit beans, cabbage oats. Once Thomas returned from checking traps to find her humming softly while stirring a pot, and the look on his face, a startled, almost shy gratitude, lingered with her for hours. One evening, she discovered a small stack of books near the hearth. Titles on history, poetry, even a worn volume of Shakespeare. She opened one, her fingers brushing the ink-smudged pages. "You read," she said, surprised. "I used to teach," Thomas answered from his chair, where he was oiling his rifle with slow care. "Before the claims, before I came up here." She looked up. "A teacher." He nodded. "I liked the work, but I liked honesty more. When I asked for fair pay, the school board said I was difficult. When I asked for better books for the children, they said I was proud. So I left." His tone was matter-of-fact, but Elizabeth felt the ache beneath it. "They said the same of me in a way," she murmured, "that I should be grateful for any hand that would keep me fed, that I was proud to think I could stand alone." Their eyes met across the firelight, and in that meeting was the first fragile thread of kinship, two people who had refused to bend until solitude became their companion. As winter deepened, snow began to fall in earnest. The world outside the cabin turned white and silent, the trails vanishing beneath drifts. Elizabeth learned to snowshoe beside Thomas, stumbling at first but soon finding the rhythm. She carried bundles of wood on her back breath, rising in sharp clouds, and with each step she felt the ground of her new life becoming firmer. Yet the shadow of Miller lingered. Sometimes at night when the wind howled like distant riders, she would start awake heart pounding, certain the knock would come again. Thomas seemed to sense it. Once as she sat up in the dark, he spoke from the loft above. "Fear wastes strength," he said, "but it's not shameful. We'll be ready if they come again. Until then, we live." The next morning, he handed her the rifle. "You'll learn," he said simply. Her hands shook as she took it, the weight heavier than she expected. He showed her how to load, how to steady her aim, how to breathe before pulling the trigger. They set bottles on a fence post, and though she missed the first 5 shots, the 6th shattered glass with a sound that rang through the cold like victory. "Better," he said, a flicker of pride in his voice. She smiled breathless. "I never thought I could." "You can do more than you think," he replied. "Most people can. They just aren't given the chance." That night she added a line to the ledger herself learned to shoot today. "Fear feels smaller." Thomas read it, nodded once, and closed the book. One afternoon as the snow fell in thick silence, Elizabeth was hanging laundry by the fire when Thomas returned, with a small bird cupped gently in his hands. Its wing was bent at a sharp angle. "Found him near the trap line," he said. "Likely flew into a branch." He set the bird carefully on the table, and Elizabeth watched as his large fingers worked with astonishing delicacy, splitting the wing with 2 thin sticks and a strip of cloth. His voice was low, steady, almost tender as he spoke to the creature. Something inside her shifted. The town had seen only his size, his silence, his distance, but here was a man who treated even a broken bird as worthy of patience and care. When the bird settled into a small basket by the hearth, Elizabeth found herself speaking before she thought. "They were wrong about you." He looked up puzzled. "Who?" "All of them. Everyone who said you were savage, untouchable, dangerous. They couldn't see past the surface." His eyes held hers, dark and searching. "And what do you see?" Her throat tightened. A man with a gentle heart. Silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was full, brimming with something she could not yet name. He looked away first, adding another log to the fire, but his hands moved slower than usual, as if he too was considering what her words meant. That night, Elizabeth lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the steady crackle of the fire beyond the door filling the darkness. For the first time since her husband's death, her loneliness was not absolute. There was a presence now, not pressing, not demanding, simply existing alongside hers. And though she did not yet call it love, she knew it was something just as rare: trust. The mountain sealed itself in snow. Drifts climbed the walls of the cabin until only the tops of the windows showed clear. Trees bent under the weight, their branches cracking in the stillness. For weeks, the world shrank to the size of their valley. The cabin, the spring, the line of snares that Thomas checked daily, sometimes returning with little, sometimes with enough. Inside, Elizabeth and Thomas fell into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like a life shared. She learned to card wool from a sack he'd stored, spinning coarse yarn by the fire. He built her a frame to weave small rugs. She began baking bread with the last of the flour, mixing it with ground acorns he had gathered. When the bread rose golden from the cast-iron pot, he smiled in quiet approval. Sometimes in the evenings, he would play the fiddle. The tunes were plain hymns, folk melodies, simple runs of notes, but they filled the cabin with warmth beyond the fire. Once, as he set the instrument aside, he caught her watching him. "What is it?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "I never thought music could live here in a place so far from town." "But it does. Music lives wherever someone listens," he replied, and though his voice was even a faint color, rose under his beard. Trust grew between them in small gestures. She mended his shirts until the seams were stronger than new. He built her a proper cupboard so she would not have to stack her supplies on the floor. They spoke more easily now about books, about her childhood in Stony Creek, about his days as a teacher. Yet beneath their words ran a current neither named. But the shadow of Miller lingered even here. One evening while Thomas was splitting wood outside, Elizabeth heard the faint echo of voices on the wind. She rushed to the door, fear quickening her breath. But when Thomas returned, he shook his head. "Just the storm shifting," he said. "But you're right to be alert. Men like Miller don't let go easy." That night she dreamed of hoofbeats crunching on snow, of fists hammering the cabin door. She woke with a start, only to hear Thomas's voice from the loft above. "You're safe," he said quietly. "Sleep again." And she did. One afternoon, after a week of heavy storms, the sky cleared. Thomas suggested they hunt beyond the ridge for larger game. Elizabeth, bundled in furs, followed him through the snow. The silence of the high country was almost wholly broken, only by the crunch of their snowshoes and the distant cry of a raven. They came upon the tracks of a deer, fresh in the snow. Thomas motioned for her to ready the rifle. Her hands trembled as she raised it, breath misting before her. The deer stood among the trees, its ears flicking, its body tense but unafraid. "Steady," Thomas whispered. "Don't think of the fear. Think of the need. We honor what feeds us." She fired. The shot rang through the trees and the deer dropped cleanly. Relief and sorrow tangled in her chest, tears stinging her eyes. Thomas touched her shoulder. "You did well," he said. "Better than well, you spared it pain. That's all any hunter should ask." They dragged the deer back together, their breath harsh in the cold. When they reached the cabin, Thomas showed her how to dress it, how to salt the meat for keeping, how to stretch the hide. It was hard work, but it left her with a fierce sense of contribution. That evening, as the venison roasted over the fire, Elizabeth looked at Thomas and said, "I belong here." He met her gaze, his dark eyes steady. "Yes," he said, "you do." The words filled her with warmth deeper than the fire. But the peace cracked 2 nights later. They were sitting by the hearth when a distant echo rolled down the mountain, the unmistakable crack of a gunshot. Not close, but not far enough to ignore. Thomas set aside the whittling knife he'd been using, his face turning grim. "That's no hunter," he muttered. "Not in weather like this." Elizabeth's heart clenched. "You think it's them?" "I think men who ride into mountains with guns in winter aren't looking for deer." He rose, pulling on his coat, checking the rifle by the door. "We'll find out soon enough." She stood too, fear shaking her voice. "What if they come tonight?" "Then they'll find 2 of us ready," he said firmly. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, there was no barrier in his expression. Only trust. I won't stand without you. Not anymore. The storm outside deepened the wind, carrying the scent of gunpowder faint on the frozen air. For the first time, Elizabeth realized this fight was not only about debts or pride. It was about whether the life they had begun to build would survive the test of men who thrived on cruelty. And as she stood beside Thomas in the firelight, her fear did not vanish, but it sharpened into resolve. Whatever came up the trail, she would not face it as a woman alone anymore. The storm broke at dusk, a wall of white sweeping across the ridge snow, slashing sideways on the wind. The cabin shuddered as if the mountain itself groaned. Inside, the fire roared, but neither Thomas nor Elizabeth sat close. Both stood, ready rifles within reach, listening for the sound they knew would come. It came just after nightfall, hooves muffled by snow, but still distinct, a rhythm of intrusion against the mountain's heartbeat. Then voices half lost in the gale. "She's in there," Miller shouted. "We'll smoke them out if we have to." Elizabeth's breath caught. Her fingers tightened around the rifle Thomas had taught her to use. Fear pressed against her ribs, but alongside it ran something steadier. Resolve. She looked at Thomas, and he nodded once, as if he already knew she would not falter. He opened the shutter a crack. 3 riders again, their figures vague shadows in the blowing snow. One carried a torch that flared orange against the night sparks snatched away by the wind. "Fire," Thomas muttered in a storm like this. "They'll kill themselves with it before they kill us." He swung the door wide, stepping out onto the porch, his rifle steady in his hands. Elizabeth followed her shawl, snapping in the wind. Her own weapon raised, though her heart pounded like a drum. "Turn back," Thomas called, his voice carrying clear above the storm. "You've no claim here." Miller's laugh cut through the snow. "Claim she owes me. And if you stand in the way, mountain man, you'll go down with her." The torch wavered, raised higher. Snow hissed as sparks fell. Elizabeth stepped forward before fear could stop her. Her voice, sharp and certain, rang across the clearing. "I owe you nothing, Edward Miller. My husband's debts died with him. You came to my door with threats and filth, and now you come here, you will not take another step." For a moment, silence fell, broken only by the storm. The men shifted uneasily in their saddles, surprised perhaps that the widow they had mocked now stood armed, defiance in her voice. Miller spat into the snow. "Brave words, but you won't fire." Elizabeth's hands shook, but she steadied them, remembering Thomas's lessons. Truth, work time. She leveled the rifle, sighted just past Miller's shoulder, and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the night, shattering the torch in his man's hand. Fire spilled into the snow, hissing out in an instant. The horses reared, snorting, half wild with fear. The torchbearer cursed, fumbling to keep his seat. Thomas's rifle spoke next, the bullet striking a tree trunk so close to Miller that bark sprayed across his coat. "The next one," Thomas said evenly, "will not miss." The storm howled around them, erasing all softness from the world. Miller's bravado faltered. He looked from Thomas's steady aim to Elizabeth's fierce gaze, and for the first time doubt showed in his eyes. "This isn't over," he shouted, but the words lacked weight. Jerking his reins, he wheeled his horse. The others followed their shapes, vanishing into the snow, swallowed by the storm that seemed eager to carry them away. When the last echo of hooves faded, Thomas lowered his rifle. He turned to Elizabeth, his dark eyes fierce, not with anger, but with something deeper. "You fired," he said. She exhaled shakily, her knees trembling. "I had to." He paused, then with quiet certainty, "You stood." She realized then that this was what he valued most. Not her need, not her desperation, but her will to stand beside him. Not a burden, not a kept woman, but a partner. Inside, the fire welcomed them back, its warmth wrapping their frozen fingers. Elizabeth set the rifle aside, her whole body still humming with adrenaline. Thomas poured her a cup of hot coffee, and when she took it, their hands brushed. For the first time, neither pulled away. "They may return," she whispered. "Then they'll find us ready," he said, "together." The word lingered, filling the space between them with something unspoken but undeniable. That night, as the storm raged outside, Elizabeth wrote in the ledger, with steady hand. Miller came again. We turned him away. "I am not afraid." She slid the book toward Thomas, and he read the words, his jaw tightening with something that was almost pride. When she looked up, his gaze held hers, and in the glow of the fire she saw the truth. The gentle heart beneath the mountain man's rough exterior, the steadfast strength that had made the townsfolk whisper, but had given her life back its weight. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future, not just of survival, but of belonging. The storm howled, but inside the cabin, two souls had chosen to stand not alone, but side by side.